February 27, 1943, 11:47 p.m. Arjuken, Norway. Joachim Ronneberg crouched in snow 400 yards from the Vemork hydroelectric plant, studying the fortress that stood between his team and what Allied intelligence considered one of the most important targets in occupied Europe. The facility, clinging to a mountainside above a nearly vertical gorge, produced heavy water, deuterium oxide, the one substance that might enable Nazi Germany to build an atomic bomb before the Allies could stop them. Ronneberg commanded 6 Norwegian commandos who had parachuted into Norway 3 days earlier, with orders to destroy Vemork's heavy water production without being detected, captured, or killed. The mission was designated Operation Gunnerside, following a failed British commando raid 4 months earlier that had ended in disaster with all participants killed or captured. The stakes were existential. If Germany developed nuclear weapons before the Allies, the war's outcome would be reversed regardless of conventional military superiority. Stopping German atomic research required destroying the one facility in occupied Europe capable of producing heavy water in quantities sufficient for nuclear experiments. The problem was that Vemork was considered impregnable. It sat on a cliff face with a 600-foot gorge on one side and a steep mountain on the other. German guards patrolled continuously. Searchlights covered all approaches. Minefields surrounded the perimeter. The production facility itself was in the basement of a concrete structure designed to withstand sabotage. Intelligence estimated that any assault would require hundreds of troops, would certainly be detected before reaching the target, and would likely fail even if attackers reached the building. The British had tried bombing the facility but couldn't achieve the precision necessary to destroy production equipment without killing hundreds of Norwegian workers. What made Ronneberg believe his team could succeed where others had failed wasn't superior firepower or numbers. It was knowledge. The team consisted of Norwegians who understood the terrain, spoke the language, and could blend with the local population if necessary. One team member, Jens Anton Paulsen, had grown up in Arjuken and knew Vemork intimately. Another, Nut Hawkelid, had contacts among plant workers who could provide intelligence about guard routines and facility layout. The plan didn't rely on overwhelming force, but on stealth, precise knowledge, and willingness to accept odds that conventional military planning would consider suicidal. The story of Operation Gunnerside begins not with commandos or Norway, but with physics laboratories in Germany, Britain, and the United States, where scientists were discovering that splitting uranium atoms released enormous energy. In 1938, German physicists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann achieved nuclear fission, demonstrating that bombarding uranium with neutrons caused the atom to split, releasing energy and additional neutrons. This discovery, published in early 1939, was immediately recognized by physicists worldwide as having enormous implications. If neutrons from one fission caused additional fissions in nearby atoms, a chain reaction might release energy in quantities that dwarfed any chemical explosive. The theoretical possibility of atomic weapons was understood by scientists in multiple countries by mid-1939, but turning theory into functioning weapons required solving enormous technical challenges. Natural uranium contained less than 1% of the fissionable isotope U-235, with the remainder being non-fissionable U-238. Separating isotopes was extremely difficult because they were chemically identical and differed only in atomic weight. Alternative approaches involved using nuclear reactors to create new elements like plutonium that were highly fissionable, but building reactors required materials that could moderate neutron speeds without absorbing them. Heavy water, deuterium oxide, was one of the few materials that could serve as a neutron moderator in nuclear reactors. Regular water absorbed too many neutrons, preventing sustained chain reactions. Graphite could also moderate neutrons, but German scientists working on reactor designs favored heavy water because their calculations suggested it provided better neutron economy. The practical problem was that heavy water was extraordinarily rare. Natural water contained only 1 part deuterium per 3,200 parts regular hydrogen. Concentrating deuterium oxide to pure heavy water required processing enormous quantities of water through expensive, energy-intensive electrolysis. The Vemork plant in Norway was, by fortunate accident, the world's largest heavy water production facility. Built in 1934 to produce fertilizer using hydroelectric power, the plant's electrolysis process as a byproduct concentrated deuterium. A small cascade system installed in the late 1930s could produce approximately 12 tons of heavy water annually, more than any other facility worldwide. When Germany occupied Norway in April 1940, securing Vemork became a priority for German atomic research programs. By 1942, the plant was operating at increased capacity, shipping heavy water to Germany for experiments that Allied intelligence feared were progressing toward functional nuclear weapons. British intelligence learned of German interest in heavy water through multiple sources. Norwegian resistance members reported increased security at Vemork and observed German scientists visiting the facility. Intelligence officers interrogating German prisoners found references to uranium research programs. Most importantly, Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist who had fled to Britain in 1943, confirmed that German scientists were actively pursuing nuclear weapons and that heavy water was crucial to their reactor designs. The accumulated evidence convinced Winston Churchill and his scientific advisors that Vemork had to be destroyed before Germany accumulated sufficient heavy water to build functioning reactors. The first attempt came in October 1942 with Operation Freshman, a glider-borne assault by British Royal Engineers. 2 gliders carrying 34 commandos were to land near Vemork, assault the facility, destroy the heavy water production equipment, and escape to Sweden. The operation failed catastrophically. Both gliders crashed in bad weather, killing some commandos immediately. Survivors were captured by German forces, interrogated, tortured, and executed. The Germans, realizing the facility was a target, increased security dramatically, adding guards, minefields, and searchlights that made subsequent attacks even more difficult. The failure of Operation Freshman convinced British planners that conventional assault was impossible, but the strategic necessity of destroying Vemork remained. The solution was to recruit Norwegian commandos familiar with the terrain and language who could infiltrate rather than assault. Relying on knowledge and stealth rather than force, the Special Operations Executive, Britain's sabotage and subversion organization, began recruiting Norwegians who had fled to Britain and were willing to return to occupied Norway for extremely dangerous missions. The team that became Operation Gunnerside consisted of 6 men: Joachim Ronneberg as commander, Knut Haukelid, Fredrik Kaiser, Kasper Eidland, Hans Storhag, and Birger Stromsheim. They ranged in age from 23 to 31, all had military training, and all had personal reasons for risking their lives against German occupation. They trained in Scotland for months, learning demolitions, winter survival, parachuting, and the specific procedures required to destroy Vemork's heavy water production without causing casualties that would trigger German reprisals against Norwegian civilians. The plan emphasized several key principles. First, avoid detection by approaching through terrain the Germans considered impassable. Second, infiltrate the facility rather than assaulting it, using stealth to reach the production area before Germans realized anything was wrong. Third, set demolition charges precisely to destroy production equipment while avoiding structural damage that might collapse the building and kill workers. Fourth, escape without being identified, so Germans wouldn't know whether the saboteurs were British commandos or Norwegian resistance, potentially preventing reprisals. Supporting the assault team was an advance party, Operation Swallow, that had parachuted into Norway in October 1942 to establish reconnaissance and prepare for the main operation. The four-man Swallow team, led by Jens Anton Paulsen, had survived 4 months in the Norwegian mountains during one of the coldest winters on record, gathering intelligence about Vemork's defenses and establishing supply caches for the Gunnerside team. Their survival in conditions that killed several people from exposure demonstrated the extraordinary toughness required for operations in Norwegian winter. The Gunnerside team parachuted into Norway on February 16, 1943, landing approximately 30 miles from their rendezvous point with the Swallow team. The drop was imprecise due to weather and navigation difficulties, forcing the team to trek through mountainous terrain carrying 200 pounds of equipment each. They took 4 days to reach the rendezvous point, arriving exhausted but intact. The reunion with the Swallow team provided crucial intelligence. German security at Vemork had increased after Operation Freshman, but intelligence from plant workers suggested the basement entrance used for waste disposal was minimally guarded and could be accessed from the gorge below the plant. The approach through the gorge was considered impossible by German planners because the slope was nearly vertical, covered in ice, and overlooked by the plant's searchlights. But Paulsen, who had climbed in the area as a youth, believed it was achievable by determined men with mountaineering skills. The route would bring them to a railway line that entered the plant through a tunnel, providing covered access once they climbed the gorge. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness, but audacity was the only advantage the team possessed. On the night of February 27th, the combined 10-man team approached Vemork. 4 men, including Paulsen and another from the Swallow team, remained outside as covering party and guides for escape. The 6 Gunnerside members would enter the plant, place explosives, and attempt to escape before German guards realized what had happened. They crossed the bridge over the gorge on foot, passing within yards of German sentries who didn't see them in the darkness and snow. Then they began the descent into the gorge. The climb down was treacherous. Ice-covered rock offered minimal handholds. Equipment had to be lowered carefully to avoid making noise that would alert guards. The men used climbing ropes sparingly, knowing that if one fell, the rope might pull others down with him. The descent took over an hour, with several near falls that could have killed climbers and compromised the mission. At the bottom, they found the river partially frozen, requiring careful crossing to avoid breaking through ice into water that would cause hypothermia within minutes. The climb up the opposite side of the gorge was even more difficult. The slope was steeper, the ice thicker, and the physical exhaustion from descending made ascending agonizing. Men pulled themselves up using stunted trees and rock outcroppings, breathing hard and trying to remain quiet despite the exertion. Searchlights from the plant swept the gorge periodically, forcing climbers to freeze in place until darkness returned. The climb took 90 minutes, bringing them finally to the railway line that entered the plant through a tunnel. Inside the tunnel, they rested briefly, checking equipment and confirming everyone had made the climb without injury. The tunnel led to the plant's basement, where the heavy water concentration equipment was located. Intelligence suggested the basement entrance would be locked but not heavily guarded because the Germans assumed no attacker could reach it through the gorge. This assumption proved correct. The door was locked but not observed. Hawkelid, trained in lock-picking, worked on the mechanism while others watched for guards. The lock yielded after several tense minutes, and the team entered the plant. Inside, they found themselves in a cable tunnel that ran beneath the concentration cells where heavy water was produced. The basement was dimly lit, with only emergency lighting, and appeared unoccupied. The team moved to the concentration room, where 18 stainless steel cells contained the heavy water being concentrated through electrolysis. These cells were the target. Destroying them would eliminate Germany's heavy water supply for months and set back any nuclear program depending on it. Ronneberg and Kaiser entered the concentration room while others stood guard. They placed explosive charges on each cell, using shaped charges designed to rupture the stainless steel without creating fragments that might cause casualties. The charges were set with 2-minute fuses and backup 30-minute fuses in case the primary fuses failed. The precision was crucial. Too much explosive would destroy the building and kill workers sleeping in upper floors. Too little would fail to destroy the cells completely. The amount used was calculated exactly for the purpose. While Ronneberg and Kaiser placed charges, a Norwegian civilian worker entered the concentration room. He was a night watchman making his rounds, unaware that saboteurs were in the building. The confrontation was potentially disastrous. If the worker raised alarm, guards would respond before the team could escape. But Haukelid, who spoke Norwegian with a local accent, convinced the worker they were British commandos, that explosives were already placed, and that he should leave the building immediately to avoid being injured. The worker, recognizing the men were Norwegian despite claims of being British, agreed to remain silent and departed quickly. Charges were set, fuses lit, and the team withdrew through the cable tunnel, out the basement door, and began running toward the gorge. They were halfway down the slope when the explosives detonated with a muffled thump that suggested successful shaped charge detonation rather than uncontrolled explosion. There was no massive blast, no collapsing building, just the sound indicating that 18 heavy water concentration cells had been ruptured and approximately 500 kilograms of heavy water destroyed. German guards, alerted by the explosion, searched the plant and discovered the sabotage. But the team was already crossing the gorge, climbing the opposite slope, and moving away from Vemork. German response was confused because they couldn't determine how attackers had reached the basement or where they'd gone. Search parties combed the area but found nothing. The team, moving through terrain they knew well, evaded all searches and began the escape to Sweden. The escape was nearly as dangerous as the infiltration. The team split into smaller groups to reduce detection risk. Some headed directly for Sweden, trekking over 300 miles through mountains in winter. Others remained in Norway, hiding with resistance sympathizers and continuing intelligence work. All survived, though several came close to death from exposure, hunger, or near encounters with German patrols. The last team member reached Sweden in May 1943, 3 months after the raid, having survived on minimal food and shelter through one of Norway's worst winters. German response to the sabotage revealed that they understood its significance. The Gestapo arrested several Norwegian workers suspected of collaborating with saboteurs, interrogating them brutally but finding no evidence because the workers genuinely knew nothing. Security at Vemork was increased further, with more guards, better lighting, and orders to shoot suspected saboteurs on sight. Heavy water production resumed after repairs, but at reduced capacity and with months of delay. Allied intelligence, monitoring German atomic research through various sources, assessed that Operation Gunnerside had significantly delayed German nuclear programs. The heavy water destroyed represented months of production. The disruption of ongoing experiments using heavy water created gaps in research continuity. Most importantly, the demonstration that Vemork was vulnerable to sabotage forced Germans to divert resources to security that might otherwise have supported research. The raid didn't end German nuclear research, but it contributed to delays that prevented Germany from achieving nuclear weapons before war's end. The United States Army Air Force bombed Vemork in November 1943, destroying much of the facility's infrastructure and killing 23 Norwegian civilians. The bombing was controversial because it demonstrated that precision bombing couldn't destroy heavy water production equipment in the basement without massive collateral damage. The sabotage approach used in Operation Gunnerside had been more effective, but American air commanders insisted on bombing to ensure the facility remained non-operational. In February 1944, Germany attempted to salvage remaining heavy water from Vemork and transport it to Germany by rail and ferry. Norwegian resistance, alerted to the shipment, planned Operation Gunnerside II to destroy the ferry carrying the heavy water across Lake Tyn. Nut Hawkelid, one of the original Gunnerside commandos, led this operation, placing explosives on the ferry that detonated mid-lake, sinking the vessel and destroying the heavy water. The ferry sinking also killed 14 Norwegian civilians aboard, a tragic outcome that resistance members agonized over but concluded was necessary to prevent the heavy water from reaching Germany. Post-war investigation of German nuclear research revealed that the program was further from success than Allied intelligence feared during the war. German scientists had made theoretical progress but faced numerous technical obstacles they hadn't solved. The dispersal of research to multiple sites after Allied bombing, shortages of materials and funding, and the evacuation of scientists from threatened areas all contributed to German failure to achieve nuclear weapons. Whether Operation Gunnerside was decisive in this failure is debated, but it certainly contributed to delays and resource diversion that complicated German research efforts. The technical judgment is that German reactor designs using heavy water were fundamentally sound and would have worked given sufficient time and resources. The problem was that Germany lacked both. Operation Gunnerside removed approximately half of Germany's accumulated heavy water supply and forced months of production delays. Combined with subsequent bombing raids and the ferry sinking, the cumulative effect was to prevent Germany from accumulating sufficient heavy water to build operating reactors during the war. Without functioning reactors, German scientists couldn't produce plutonium or gain experimental experience necessary for bomb design. The strategic assessment is that Operation Gunnerside represented one of the most successful special operations of World War II measured by results achieved relative to resources committed. 6 commandos accomplished what conventional military operations couldn't, destroying a heavily defended target without casualties and escaping successfully. The mission demonstrated that careful planning, detailed intelligence, rigorous training, and willingness to accept risk could achieve objectives that overwhelming force couldn't accomplish. The individual stories of Gunnerside participants reflect diverse post-war paths. Joachim Ronneberg returned to Norway after the war, worked in broadcasting, and lived to age 99, dying in 2018 as the last surviving member of the raid. He consistently downplayed his heroism, insisting the operation succeeded through teamwork and luck rather than individual courage. Nut Hawkelid wrote memoirs describing operations in Norway and later worked in intelligence. The other team members returned to civilian life, rarely speaking publicly about their wartime service. The moral dimension of Operation Gunnerside centers on the civilian casualties from subsequent operations against Vemork. The ferry sinking killed 14 Norwegian civilians, including children. The bombing raid killed 23 civilians. These deaths were consequences of targeting Vemork, though not direct results of the original Gunnerside raid. Resistance members involved in these operations carried guilt for civilian deaths throughout their lives. Even while recognizing that preventing German nuclear weapons potentially saved millions of lives, the trolley problem made real, kill innocents to prevent greater killing. The legacy of Operation Gunnerside extends beyond its immediate military impact. The raid became a symbol of Norwegian resistance and demonstrated that small, determined groups could strike effectively against occupation forces. The operation influenced post-war special operations doctrine, showing the value of indigenous personnel, detailed planning, and missions emphasizing stealth over force. Modern special operations forces study Gunnerside as an example of how to achieve strategic objectives through small-scale actions. The heavy water production at Vemork never resumed at pre-war levels after the raid and subsequent attacks. The facility returned to fertilizer production after the war and operated until 1991. Today, it's a museum dedicated to Norwegian resistance and the wartime operations that targeted it. Visitors can see the concentration cells, the cable tunnel used by Gunnerside, and exhibits explaining the heavy water's role in nuclear research. The site serves as memorial to those who died in operations against the facility and recognition of the commandos, who risked everything to stop what they believed was Hitler's atomic bomb. The question of whether Operation Gunnerside actually prevented Germany from developing nuclear weapons is ultimately unanswerable with certainty. German nuclear research faced multiple obstacles beyond heavy water shortages, funding limitations, personnel evacuations, material shortages, and fundamental organizational problems that prevented coordinated progress. Removing heavy water availability was one obstacle among many. But the mission's planners didn't know this in 1943. They knew Germany was pursuing nuclear weapons, that heavy water was crucial to certain approaches, and that Vemork was the only source. They acted on best available intelligence to eliminate a threat that appeared existential. That the threat was less immediate than feared doesn't diminish the courage required to act against it. The 6 men who descended into the Arjukan Gorge on February 27, 1943, understood they were attempting something that conventional military wisdom considered impossible. The approach was too difficult, the facility too well defended, the odds too long. But they also understood that conventional military wisdom had failed at Vemork, and that extraordinary missions sometimes required attempting the impossible. They succeeded through preparation, knowledge, physical courage, and the luck that favors operations that minimize what can go wrong. They destroyed equipment that took months to replace, delayed research programs that threatened Allied victory, and escaped without casualties to themselves or innocent civilians. By any measure, Operation Gunnerside achieved its objectives and demonstrated that well-planned special operations could accomplish what conventional forces could not, striking precisely at strategic targets while minimizing collateral damage and maintaining secrecy that prevented reprisals. The mission to stop Hitler's atomic bomb succeeded, even if Hitler's bomb was never as close to reality as Allied intelligence feared, because acting against perceived threats is required when the consequences of inaction are potentially catastrophic.